Meanwhile, Falwell flew in his right-hand man, Jerry Nims, to examine Bakker's books.
Well, I think he knew the end was coming, and he was getting as much as he could. In the year before he left, he paid himself $1.9 million. Now, that was at a point in time when, by his own words and testimony, he knew that ministry was against the wall and was ready to collapse. Most of that money was in bonuses. If he had done that in a profit entity, it would have hung him by his heels.
What surprised Nims was that the IRS had been auditing Bakker since 1983. The taxman had found excessive compensation, worth more than $150,000 in 1981, just under $300,000 in 82, and well over $500,000 in 83. Still, the IRS did nothing.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I remember a report from 1981 to 1983 with the IRS, and they had documented, at that period of time, so this is early on, over $850,000 in undocumented expenses on the credit cards, and it got worse and worse.
Free loans, free homes, free cars took the Bakkers' total take from $360,000 in 1981 to $650,000 in 82, and finally in 83 to $1.5 million. Jerry Falwell wonders why the IRS did so little for so long.
I can only say that the Internal Revenue Service has been very, very slow, 6 years, in coming to conclusions. I'm not in a position to know if they procrastinated or not, if this is the normal procedure.
Jerry Falwell was one of the televangelists called to testify before Congress last October. With extreme politeness, the politicians assured the preachers that they did not want to step on their First Amendment rights. Still, in the light of the PTL scandal, they wanted to know how the public could be sure that their donations were being put to proper use. Some of the toughest questions were put to the newly appointed commissioner of the IRS, Lawrence Gibbs.
The Internal Revenue Service did submit an internal audit recommending that PTL tax-exempt be revoked. That was made in 1985.
And here it is, 87, and nobody knows what was the outcome of that recommendation. Would you sit on it for 6 years?
I would neither sit on it nor would I deny the organization the rights that it has under the law to pursue its remedies with the procedural safeguards that they're entitled to use.
Then it appears to me that you are giving a strong signal to these TV ministers to do any and everything that they want to.
Is this a typical case? How long do you take to make an audit on a normal TV ministry?
It is only after it comes to our attention in a credible way from the public that we can even begin an audit.
Do you see where filing an annual report by churches would be in violation of the constitutional right of separation of church and state?
I have assumed, perhaps erroneously, that that was the reason, certainly one of the prominent reasons, for specifically excluding them by statute in 1969.
I've had the feeling personally that both the Congress and Internal Revenue Service has looked the other way on a lot of these audits. But wouldn't you know if they were on national television raising $5, $10, $20 million, that they are out there?
Mr. Chairman,
it seems to me like your weakness in this is getting the form. Should all organizations be required to file some kind of form?
What in God's name could be even remotely considered a violation of the constitutional rights of churches to say that they should file an annual report as to how much money they got and what they did with it?
What we run into in this area are the competing considerations of the tax law versus the constitutional limitations on the establishment and exercise of free exercise of religion.
Just down the road from Congress are the headquarters of the moral majority. Jerry Falwell handed over its presidency to Jerry Nims last fall. By then, both men had quit the board of PTL in disgust. But Nims remains critical of the government's lack of action in the PTL affair.
I am troubled by the government's role in this situation. Now we'll see what the future holds. But as far as going back to 81, 82, and 83, what I looked at certainly bore out the need to investigate.
The IRS was not the only federal agency whose reluctance to investigate PTL gave Dr. Nims cause for concern. In the summer of 1987, months after the PTL scandal had begun to make nationwide headlines, the Department of Justice was dragging its feet too. according to the former U.S. Attorney in Asheville, Charles Brewer.
Anything I say concerning why the Justice Department treated the PTL investigation differently from the way it's treated other criminal matters during my 6 years would be really a matter of my speculating. And I feel that a possible reason may relate to the political aspects of the fundamentalist, charismatic Christian movement. It has come to be a very important component of Republican presidential politics.
Brewer himself is a supporter of Ronald Reagan and stalwart of the North Carolina Republican Party. When the scandal broke in 1987, he found his phone ringing as press and federal investigators asked him when someone was going to do something. But before he could start an investigation, he got a phone call from the Justice Department in Washington.
I've never been contacted by the department in regard to an investigation. Typically, the department will be involved in significant matters when you're talking about whether there'll be a prosecution or not. But I was really surprised to be contacted in regard to an investigation. And secondly, I was surprised at the high level in which the contact was coming from.
The call came from Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns, who told Brewer to fly up to Washington to a meeting at the Justice Department. Because PTL activities take place in North and South Carolina, Brewer thought there might be some question about overlapping jurisdiction.
But the real question wasn't who would be doing the investigation. The real question on the table was whether there'd be an investigation at all. And this really surprised me. We basically went around the table, everybody articulating what they thought should take place, and my position was that there should be an investigation and that it should begin now.
Brewer says two of those at the meeting argued that the department should tread gingerly on PTL's First Amendment rights. They were Michael Durney of the Tax Division and Vinton D. Lyde, the U.S. Attorney from Columbia, South Carolina.
You simply have to have an investigation to determine whether there's anything to prosecute or whether there's any potential of anything to prosecute. And if you take the position you're not going to investigate, then you'll never know. And with all of the coverage coming out of the media concerning this, that anyone in the world would have questioned whether there would be an investigation was a shock to me.
Jerry Nims, at that time still part of the caretaker management at PTL, was also frustrated by this apparent reluctance to enforce the law.
And I did go to one government official that shall remain nameless. And I was just using an analogy. I said, I'm a citizen, a friend, and you're the policeman, and I think I just witnessed a bank robbery. You're the cop. What are you going to do about it?
And Nims was accusing the Department of Justice of dragging its feet in the matter. He was calling for a federal criminal investigation, and I thought with the PTL, who in the eyes of the law would be considered the victim, calling for it publicly, the media calling for it, and the federal investigative agencies asking for it, that the department would have no choice but to authorize a criminal investigation into these allegations.
By now, Brewer was back home after a second meeting in Washington. In Charlotte, agents from the FBI, IRS, and the Postal Service were beginning to pursue their own lines of inquiry when Brewer got another phone call from the Department of Justice.
Charles Brewer.
This time he was told that any future federal investigations would be based not in Charlotte, which is a short drive from Heritage USA, but 80 miles away in Columbia, South Carolina.
Most of the federal investigative resources are located in Charlotte. The tax audit that had been going on was being handled by the IRS out of North Carolina. The South Carolina IRS had nothing to do with it at all, as I understand it. The South Carolina FBI had not had any involvement.
And Brewer's office was not to have any involvement either. The PTL case would be handled by Vinton D. Lyde and Michael Durney.
It struck me as being unusual when you assign an investigation to assign it to the two entities that did not want an investigation to take place at all, and to specifically exclude from the investigation the entity that wanted it.
Now that a grand jury is hearing evidence, the Department of Justice cannot comment on Brewer's allegations. Neither can the IRS, which is now seeking to recover $55 million from PTL and almost $10 million from the Bakkers personally. But would either agency be doing anything had it not been for the Jessica Hahn scandal? It's a question that causes concern for both conservatives and liberals alike.
Well, as we've come to see the amount of foot dragging there was in this whole PTL affair by government agencies, I think that is a scandal in itself. It would appear there was great reluctance to move in a situation that cried out for government action.
I think there is a difficulty, and that is the separation between church and state in a curious way working to protect Jim Bakker and his associates. I think the government was reluctant to move in to what they perceived was a church.
Net effect of what the government did was to instill increased confidence in Jim Bakker and PTL that they could make false solicitations for money over the air, thus bamboozling many thousands of innocent people out of a great deal of money. And that's an awful wrong thing that should never have been done.
But despite everything, there are those who still believe.
Good afternoon. Bring Bakker's Back Club. May I help you? Yes.
Just outside the gates of Heritage USA, members of the Bring Bakker's Back Club reach back to what Jim and Tammy once meant to them.
Yes.
They forgive them their sins and try to keep their faith.
Tammy blessed me so much, I don't care what they say about her mascara running down her face. I mean, she was sincere in what she said, and I just loved her. The minute we drove on the grounds, it was like going to heaven. And you just felt like you were just lifted right up, and you were that way the whole time. You walked around and you weren't even touching the ground hardly.
Well, first place, I think the Lord built it, but he gave Jim Bakker a vision. And when Jim Bakker built this, he built it with the Christian families where they could come. I still love Jim and Tammy, and I'm sure the Lord will work everything out. It's not for me to judge.
I just feel like somebody died, and we don't have them anymore, that's all.
Frontline made repeated invitations to Jim and Tammy Bakker to be interviewed for this program. They declined. The Bakkers and other former PTL leaders now await possible indictments on tax evasion and fraud charges from the federal grand jury meeting in North Carolina. No indictments are expected for at least 6 months. Later this week, here in Washington, the national religious broadcasters will hold their annual meeting.